And so to Aston Martin, full marks, got to say to Matt Bishop and his team up at Silverstone, because this was, well, it's almost a real car. I think it's a real car. I actually ran today at Silverstone. I know Scarbs is impressed with the detail already, which is great. We'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, I think we just need to say, so Red Bull, what are you thinking? I mean, they did a launch yesterday, and it was basically the show car that Formula One Liberty put out at the British Grand Prix last year in another iteration, but nonetheless, really that car in the Red Bull livery, and it's not this year's car at all. Right now, I think we say full marks to Aston Martin, and let's get down to it, Scarbs. You can see in the background the video they put out as well, which is a nice one, and you're quite impressed, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed from the point of view that they've actually shown us a real car. As you say, it's ran now in testing, so we know that this has been made. It's not just a CGI render. And it's got some interesting details. It's got some interesting approaches to the new regulations. A few of them I hadn't quite planned on, but you can see their thinking. So it is actually just a really interesting car. Whether that translates into performance at this time of year, it's impossible. It's just a design competition at this stage rather than something on track.
So what's caught your eye?
Well, I mean, there's lots on the car because it's the first real car that we've had to play with. So if we sort of go front to rear, first thing you've got to notice is that the front wing's much higher and the nose tip's much higher than we're being used to. There's two things behind this. First of all, the regulations have created a higher nose. And this is so that you get more air under the car to the underfloor tunnels to give you the downforce. But equally, there's a window in which you can place that front wing. And Aston Martin have chose to raise that wing as high as you possibly can to get more air under the car. That all makes sense. The nose is, again, like the Haas, a very straightforward, chiselled version of what you can fit into the volumes that you have to fit there. But there's some details of the front wing that are quite interesting. So like the outermost sections are actually tipped down slightly, creating downwash, whereas all the downforce is created kind of in this mid-section of the span, and then the middle of the nose, again, is slightly downwash. You see that front main plane section hanging down below the nose, all trying to direct airflow under the car. So we're going to see a lot of that. Some teams will play with the mix of the highs and the lows on the front wing, so we'll see a difference there in each car. But really, the big change is in side pods. Now, this year, you're allowed to have side pods that come much further forwards, and equally, you can now, again, have openings in the tops of the side pods to let cooling air out. And the benefit of that is you can actually have all the air come out of these louvers, and therefore you can make the rest of the bodywork so much tighter. And it also means, because the position of these louvers quite high up along the side pod top, is the air that comes out of them avoids the beam wing and it avoids the top wing, goes out between the two of them. It's a really efficient way of getting the air out.
Are those louvers a relatively recent thing allowed by the regulations, or was that there from day one?
Well, they used to be all over the cars, if you can remember back into 2008.
Yeah.
2009, they effectively...
Yeah, no, but I'm talking about the 2022 regulations.
Yeah.
Because I know there have been like sort of 15 updates to the regulations in the last 3 months.
They've always been part of the plans of the regulations. So
Right.
you would have seen them in quite a lot of the versions of the FIA concept, and that's kind of gone through all the way from the letter A.
And that louver side hasn't changed at all?
Not too
really
much. They actually made them a lot bigger than I expected them to be in the final versions of the regulations, and you can see that on the Aston Martin at the whole top of the side pod.
Yeah. I don't really want to interrupt your train of thought, but I've got to get in here and say, because of that, are we seeing, do you think, under the surface, is there going to be different packaging of the battery and systems and everything else? Is everything even tighter or maybe looser?
Well, in terms of the radiators, yes, completely different. So normally the radiators would tip from the top near the cockpit and then slant down all the way to the floor, almost behind the fuel tank where the engine is.
Yeah.
What Aston Martin have done is they look like they've actually made the whole radiator package almost horizontal, tilted slightly in a couple of directions, all the way along that side pod. So everywhere you see those louvers on the top of the car, there's a radiator underneath it, or intercooler or oil cooler, or whatever it might be. So that means at kind of floor level, there's no radiators at all. And that's what has allowed Aston to create this almost double floor shape, deep undercut side pod, which we saw, with the Ferrari and with some Toro Rossos quite recently as well. And that's all trying to get the airflow around the side pod without it being impacted by the bodywork and get it working up over the beam wing and the top of the diffuser section. So it's an efficient way of doing things. As I say, it's been done in the past, maybe not with great success. I don't think that was the downfall of those particular cars, this side pod concept, but it kind of comes in and out of fashion. And again, just like with the Haas, it's just another way of doing this, and everyone else is going to have slightly different ways of playing with this.
for sure. And at the moment, you've got to say they look pretty nice. I mean, that's been the thing from day one, isn't it? The 2022 car is a nice looking Formula One car. So it's passing that test straight away in this form, I would say. The next question, and I'm probably the only guy that can ask this because I'm old enough to remember the times, but if I go back to the original ground effect days, we're talking early 80s, let's say, or late 70s, there was a very different approach to roll centers, center of gravity, wheel movement, because of the amount of downforce there was and the spring rates that were being run. Because this downforce is now coming from a new area, if you like, new in inverted commas, do you think that we're getting into a new realm potentially of wheel geometry and suspension geometry now and spring rates and compared with the last, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 years?
Yeah, there's going to be a big change in how the team set the suspension up for several reasons. As you say, first of all, it's a different type of car. Now, I know we spoke late last year about is it high rake or low rake, and it turns out there's going to be no rake.
Zero
the cars
rake.
are going to be run super flat.
Yeah.
So that completely changes what you want to do with the suspension, particularly as we saw the collapsing rear suspension on the cars, particularly the Mercedes in Brazil last year. Yeah. But also, the suspension regulations have changed massively. So whereas before you would have lots of complicated stuff actually at the rockers operated by the push or the pull rod, and then you'd have loads of set things off in the side pods, remote gas cylinders and hydraulics and stuff. All of that clever stuff's been banned, inerters have been banned. So effectively all you're allowed to have is a kind of conventional spring, be it a coil spring or a torsion bar, and a damper operated by the rockers. So lots of the clever stuff has gone away, and you've still got quite a squashy tyre, despite it being low profile, as you may describe, because the 18-inch wheel, because the tyre is actually bigger in diameter. It's still got quite a big sidewall, still lots of movement there. So the teams, probably more so than the Aero, have got more to play with and more to understand in getting the suspension to work, to keep the car in that ride height window that it likes to be at, depending on what the downforce is doing, depending if you're braking, accelerating, cornering. All of that needs to be worked out. But the difference between now and back in the late 70s, early 80s is all they could really do back then was just put stiffer and stiffer springs in, wasn't they? We got to the stage where it was quite ridiculous.
They were running 2,500, 3,000 pound springs by Vegas 81.
Yeah, and when you jack the car up, the springs just fell out their spring mount because couldn't preload them because it would be madness. Now you've got 7-post rigs, you've got dynamic test rigs as well, so they'll be much better equipped to cope with this now. That said, teams will get it wrong, some teams will get it much better, and
I think that's going to be an interesting point, isn't it? How many teams get on top of that, because you're looking at this now and you're thinking, wow, that Aston Martin looks really good. I mean, how's that not going to win every Grand Prix? I mean, there's going to be differences, obviously, but where are they going to come from now? Potentially, they're going to come from setup and things like that with suspension, which is quite a good thing. It's quite a cool thing because we haven't had to talk about suspension very much in the last decade, have we?
We haven't.
And if we're getting back to things like spring rates and roll centers and Ackerman, I don't know, whatever, toe in, toe out, all the old things, cambers, that's going to be... Actually, so I mentioned cambers. It's going to be interesting to see if they run the same sort of cambers they did on the 13-inch wheels on these. I don't know if it's the wheel size or whether it's going to be the downforce thing that dictates cambers, but that'll be an interesting thing when you see them coming down the pit lane for the first time to see how much negative or not they're running on the front, particularly.
I've not seen any figures from Pirelli. They were running a negative 3 3/4 degrees of camber for the past, 10 or more years. Because the tyre is fairly squashy, I think they're still going to be running, well over or well under, because it's a negative number, 3 degrees of camber, and I don't think that will change massively. But teams have got a lot to learn. They've got to get the aero working, the suspension working, and these tyres, and all of the clever stuff with the suspension and some of the stuff with the heat from the brakes has all been taken away from them. So, some teams will get it right.
Heat from the brakes has been taken away. Explain that.
So if you remember over the past few years, we've spoken a lot about how the heat from the brakes can be either directed or directed away from the wheels.
Yes.
Because you heat the wheels up, you heat the tyre up. So particularly at the front, you want the brake heat to go into the wheel, into the tyre, and the brake ducts are designed for that. At the back, you don't want any heat from the brakes getting in because the rear tyres get too hot themselves anyway. So you try and blank everything off. Now you've got a very simple drum inside the tyre, and you can't have hot air coming out of that. So particularly at the front, if you can't get the tyres into their working range, you can't just open up areas of the front brake ducts to get the heat passing through, because all the heat has to actually go not out through the wheel, no, actually goes back out through the inside of the wheel, which again is quite a different thing. And when we look at the lovely white side pods on the Haas, they could look very dirty by the end of the race. So that trick has been taken away from them. There is a limited amount they can play with.
But has that been taken away for aerodynamic reasons?
It's a bit of both. It's partly aerodynamic, because you don't want the heat going out. They want to control where the dirty air is coming out from the brakes, which, as I say, will be on the inside of the wheels now. But equally, it's another one of those things which is a bit, silliness in F1. It's like using the brakes to manage your tyres. That's just...
So they're trying to get away from that element.
They're trying to get away with some of the sort of silly things Formula One teams and the huge amount they invest. So all the teams, if you think about it, it's now a spec wheel, these 18-inch wheels. Everyone gets a BBS rim. They're identical. Previously, each team would get through 200 wheels in a race weekend. That's how many you need to equip each of your cars with all of the compounds. And then you think, well, hold on, you need different specs of wheel. And they were creating thousands of wheels just to prepare for a season, which is incredibly wasteful. And when you know about Formula One's sustainability message, creating lots of wheels each year just for the sake of it is an incredibly wasteful way of doing things. So while lots of people don't like the idea of a spec wheel, having one really does kind of point teams in the right way of actually managing their budgets and operating in a sustainable way.
Scarbs, I know this is speculative, but what do you imagine Mercedes have been working on over the winter for this iteration of their engine? Power unit, sorry.
So they've got various things. The problems they had last year, the overheating problems they had from a few years ago seems to be solved. The power output relative to the Honda seems to be quite well balanced, but they had big degradation in the engine during its life, which is why Lewis had that kind of spicy engine at the back end of last year. It didn't have any more power, but they just didn't run it for as long, so they could run it maximum beans all of the time it was working. So they need to work on that. Obviously, you've got the E10 fuel, so that's 10% of ethanol now, and it's not as free as it was before, whereas with the E5 they were running, you could play about with which biological elements you were putting into that 5%. Now it has to be pretty much 5% ethanol, which takes 10% of the fuel away from the boffins to play with, to add the fun stuff to make the engines really powerful. So that's going to be played about. But I also know that Mercedes in particular have been working on the shape of their engine. You can see the big bulges under the Aramco or Crypto logos on there. You still have these big plenums. And they don't appear to have changed. But I know they're trying to slim the back of the engine down, something Honda were very good at last year, and potentially also with the exhaust, although I did have a wild theory. I think that's actually been blown out of the water now, so we won't go into that one. But they've been just working on the packaging and just the longevity of that engine, because it's going to be a long season this year. You still only have 3 power units, a couple of bits you only get 2 of. That's a lot for those engines to go through. Will Mercedes be able to last the entire season with 3 power units per driver, or are they going to do what last year and say, well, we'll take the penalties and swap them out when we need
plan
them
into it, yeah.
So it'll be interesting.
What about transmissions? Anything to be said there about gearboxes and transmissions, final drives, diffs?
There have been regulation changes. What the teams have actually done in order to cope with that is very hard to say at this stage, but the gearboxes now have finally actually been worded in, so you have the gearbox cassette and the outer carrier, like the carbon structure that we used to call a gearbox case.
That we exclusively revealed
on
this channel.
What's that? So
4 or 5 years ago,
I think it was.
Absolutely.
And so that's in the regulations. Gearbox, now you get 4 per season. So that means that, if your gearbox blows up, you can put another one in without penalty until you reach your 4th gearbox. But what's quite interesting is the rules have actually forced the gear cluster to actually be a specific position away from the final drive, which is also linked to the rear axle line. So the whole gearbox has had to be shunted backwards towards the rear axle line. Now, Mercedes and Ferrari in recent years have actually been pushing the gearbox forwards for aerodynamic reasons. They should have a long shaft running out to the differential, because it allows you to slim the bodywork out, get loads of air over the diffuser. You can't do that now. So there is an aerodynamic blockage there, and it also puts the gearbox in the way of where Mercedes had been placing all the springs and dampers. So the pull rods have been moved forwards and the rockers have been moved forwards, so all of the springs and dampers appear to be in front of the gear cluster now, which is a bit more awkward from
But why have they done that in the rules? What was the intention there? Just cause some blockage? I
think one is, just to make life awkward aerodynamically, although I'm sure that wasn't the primary reason. The other thing equally is to make sure all the gearboxes, teams aren't throwing lots of money at gearbox development, because that's the way it was starting to go in terms of very unusual layouts and shaft lengths. But the other thing as well is if they've shunted the whole gearbox back towards the rear axle line, that means the space between the gearbox and the engine, which is effectively a spacer, which is actually just an extension of the outer carbon carrier, is kind of empty space now. So if they want in future seasons to shorten the wheelbase any further, there will be much less obstacle to do that. So I think this potentially, while it does sound a bit of a weird thing to do, does mean that we potentially could have shorter cars quite easily over the next sort of 3, 4, 5 seasons.
Well, that's a good thing. But just talking about dimensions now, it's still a big car, right? In general, I mean, the Aston Martin is a big, heavy car.
It's still a big car. You've got a 3.6 metre wheelbase, which is enormous by any car standards.
Yeah.
You're talking about, Mercedes E-classes. I know we did the dimensions for one work. Actually realised the Formula One car is bigger in every dimension, just not in volume.
Yeah.
And they're heavy cars because you've got big, heavier wheels, big, heavier tyres. Lots of safety additions this year. So the weight has ballooned. But the plan is for the 2025 regs, which is the next big step change, will be to make the cars shorter and make them lighter. So it's not that they don't want to do it. It's just, one step at a time. They'll keep chipping away at this.
That's brilliant, Scarbs. Just to go back to Red Bull, where we started, what do you imagine they're going to do? They've shown this car to the world, which is basically the car that was at Silverstone last year. It's just the generic F1 car. And they've put their livery on it. And I presume when their actual car comes, which is what, the RB18, I guess that's just going to just appear without any fanfare at all, and Max will be driving it around Barcelona or whatever.
We have the 3-day shakedown, as it's called, at Barcelona coming up. And they will probably either just show that car to the photographers or just start testing with it. It will look, I would suspect, absolutely nothing like the car that they claimed to be the RB18 at the launch, because that's just a plastic shell.
Yeah.
So it will be very different. No doubt there's going to be some clever stuff on there. As I say, everyone expected every one of these cars to look exactly the same this year, and it's not going to be the case. Everyone's going to have different ideas, and it's going to be really interesting to see what shapes, side pods, noses, and bits and pieces are out there.
Very much so.